So that evening, I met with Frank, the CEO and owner of the company, and I resigned from my position. Frank didn't accept my resignation. Instead, he asked for an opportunity to try and fix this. He admitted that he didn't know exactly what he needed to do to help repair it, but he was going to figure it out. So before the incident occurred, I shared many stories of my upbringing with Frank. And in his attempt to repair the situation, he came to me and he asked what I felt was a very profound question. He said, "Barb, if your father were still alive today, what would he do to help resolve this situation?" And that day, I really saw the core of Frank's heart. He was searching to make this better for me. I realized in that moment that I mattered to him. And in fact, I did belong at SC Fuels. I shared with him that my father took every opportunity to teach my family all that he could about our African-American culture. He worked hard to show us, my siblings and I, that our culture was really something to be proud of. And when Frank heard that, he was off and running. He just kind of took charge from there. So October of 2005, Frank came to my office and he asked, "What are you doing this weekend? What are you and the family up to?" And he then invited me and my family to the Rosa Parks Memorial at the Rotunda in Washington, D.C. So my 11-year-old and my 6-year-old daughters, they were able to see the Metro bus where Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat for a white male. In 2019, he comes back into my office and he gives me 2 tickets, and they are tickets for President Barack Obama's inauguration. A dear friend of mine was dying of colon cancer at the time. Adrienne was 46 years old at the time of the inauguration with less than a few weeks to live. She was known for jokingly saying that she wanted to have Barack's babies one day. So I decided that she was the person that was going with me to the inauguration. She really had a love for him. No, she never had his babies, but she did survive 6 months longer than the doctors had anticipated. Had Frank accepted my resignation, I would not have been able to have either of those experiences. I would not regard the person I was trying to run from as a trusted friend today. Most importantly, I believe staying helped this person have a different respect for people of color. Frank, my dear friend, my ally, my mentor, passed away almost 2 years ago, and I often miss him. My plan is to retire from SC Fuels in 2023. I want to leave the place that I want to leave this place better than I found it. That's what my friend Frank did for me. He left me way better than he found me. So where am I in this journey today? I am hesitant to walk into this with a big sign shouting, "Embrace diversity and inclusion." Instead, I want to place this in their hearts. When I first started going to church, I felt something different. I felt a greater sense of belonging. It didn't take someone guilt tripping me into behaving differently. Therefore, the change that I made in my behavior was more sustainable. I want whatever I decide to do here for SC Fuels to be sustainable and for it to carry further than what I'm going to be there to carry. So let's dive in. So Jerry, can we pop up the slides on the recognition or the engagement?
Yep, you're on screen.
I just lost my view here. Let me try this. Yeah, I just lost my view. Sorry, guys.
You're good. Take your time.
There we go. So each year, SC Fuels conducts an engagement survey that's sponsored by Gallup. We call it the Q12, as there are only 12 questions that Gallup feels determines employee engagement. In 2019, our overall score was 3.94 out of 5, and now in 2021, we're at 4.15 out of 5. So it's not a bad score. Obviously, there are some areas that we can work on to improve that. There are 5 areas of engagement that highly correlate with inclusion. And these are some of the questions. Do I have an opportunity to do my best every day? Does my supervisor demonstrate that they care for me? Does someone encourage development? At work, my opinions seem to count. And do I have an understanding of our mission and purpose? This year, our score for does my opinion count was 3.96, which is a little bit lower than what we would like to see, but it gives us an opportunity to really begin to work on an action plan that's going to help us be able to achieve the goals that we really would like to see when it comes to that. There are many questions that we can ask in diving in a little bit deeper so that we get more information and can understand why people may not feel that their opinions really do count in our organization. So my team is working on building action plans such as what's on the screen there to really help us to stay focused on what the goal is and to move in the direction that we need to move in. So I am reaching out as a practitioner today to an expert in this field, Dr. Anita. And I'm looking for Dr. Anita's help to help me navigate through this process. Dr. Anita, help!
Hi, Barb. It's good to see you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. First of all, I want to congratulate you and the team for all of the work that you've done. And on your 3 focused areas, for this particular consultation, I want to pull the thread on item 2 there, which is managers valuing employees for their strengths. First of all, I am in love with the Gallup Q12. It gets to the heart of employee engagement issues very quickly and very succinctly. And as a Gallup certified strengths coach, I look at every opportunity to build in strengths into all of my client engagements wherever possible, because that also highlights diversity. When we talk about diversity of strengths, of talents, of backgrounds, of gifts, of approaches to problem solving, that's a really easy way to get people comfortable with diversity. So for each one of our focus areas, I've got 3 different questions, but we're only going to focus on one. And right now, well, actually for this one, I want to focus on 2. If you look at those 4 domains of strengths, typically when you think about the work that's associated with diversity, inclusion, belonging, and that's my focus area is DIB, we look at the strengths of influencing and relationship building. And when you think about your leaders, who among them possess strengths in these 2 domains?
There are 9 executives on our team, and I would say that our legal counsel is very strong on influencing. Surprise, surprise, right? Mm-hmm. Our CIO is probably pretty strong in that area as well. And then myself and some of our sales executives, I say that we would hit that domain of relationship building.
So does that leave about half of your staff in neither one of those domains?
Correct.
Yeah. So if we look at that, we might think, well, how do we bridge that gap? Because they're just not wired that way. And that's not necessarily the case. If we look over to the left under executing, when you think about diversity, inclusion, belonging, you could probably have someone leverage their strength in restorative, right?
Correct. That would be my CFO for sure.
There you go. There you go. And if we look at the domain of strategic thinking, we've got the option of futuristic, ideation, and those are areas of strengths where we could also marry that with some of the principles in diversity, inclusion, belonging. Would you agree with that?
I would strongly agree. Our CEO really fits well into that. So it really brings the team together quite nicely.
So all is not lost, even though we might think that, well, if we don't have those strengths specifically in influencing and relationship building, how are we going to get these people on board? That's not the case. We just have to look at more diverse ways to get them involved. And so when you look at this graph of the different domains of strengths, what do you notice about their ability to honor individuality and cultivate belongingness across all four of these domains? Do you see that it's
Sure.
possible?
Speaking off the cuff, there's opportunity for us here. We tend to call on the same people for projects instead of really understanding the team's strength. And often when we do that, it stifles us from thinking more broadly to really focus on the project and for that project to be as good as it could be. We get used to doing the same thing all the time instead of branching out.
And what you've just said is one of the reasons why I love to bring strengths into the conversation, because have we mentioned anything about race, ethnicity, orientation? No, we have not. But we've still talked about strengths, and strengths are going to show up in different packages, so to speak.
Yes, we do.
Good. Next chart. So now we're talking about how a sense of belongingness is being defined, what it looks like, sounds like, feels like, and acts like. And typically when we think about business results, I've heard the phrase that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And I like to say that if you can't explain it, you can't attain it. So one of the ways that I like to do this when I work with clients is to ask them to brainstorm a series of words that give them a sense of belonging. And once we do that, I'll say, all right, now let's pick one that we all agree on. And let's get really specific about what this word means in terms of what it looks like, what it sounds like, what it feels like, and what it acts like. So that being the case, how do your executives define belonging in terms of these four areas?
So in the Q12 survey, there's a question that's asked, do I have a best friend at work? And normally the teams that score higher in that category with that question, you can see that the team is just working very close together. They respect each other, they're collaborating, they feel like they're surrounded with support. They feel that they're surrounded by people that care about them. So they're high producing. The teams where that score is lower to that question, we see productivity, we see turnover, and we see the commitment that team has suffering pretty greatly sometimes. When I think about this on a personal level, Dr. Anita, I remember we lived in an all-Black neighborhood until I was about 13 or 14 years old. And then we moved to an all-white neighborhood. And I remember sitting in some of my classes in junior high school trying to connect. And I would see some of the girls sitting next to each other and they were looking at each other eye to eye. And I remember feeling that I don't belong. There's no one here for me to look eye to eye with them. And it was a hard thing, but that was one of those moments that I remember that I just didn't feel like I belonged. And it was simple, just eye contact.
Our backgrounds are similar because I, like you, moved from a predominantly Black neighborhood to a predominantly white neighborhood and experienced the same things. And in the two examples that you just gave me, at work when people collaborate and then making eye contact, those are beautiful examples of what belonging acts like. We're working together and you're looking at me. Belonging could sound like, hey, we really missed having you in the meeting. Someone telling you we want you there, right? It could also look like someone pulling out a seat and making space for you at the table. So when we can identify what belonging looks like, acts like, feels like, and sounds like, it's much easier to say, this is what it means to me as an individual. Let's have a discussion about that. And let's see where we can come to agreement as to what that looks like. When we do this work, it's not necessarily about reaching agreement, but it's about raising awareness, in my viewpoint. And when we can raise awareness around some of these things, something as simple as what belonging means, then we can reach agreement as to what that means and help push the needle just a little bit further. Does that work for you, Barb?
Absolutely.
Okay, let's go to the next question.
Sure.
So now we're talking about how are gaps and expectations being defined and identified and communicated, specifically in terms of inclusive leadership styles. Now, again, going back to simple business practices, unless we know where we're going and unless we know what the target is and unless we know how to close that gap, it's very hard to determine whether or not we're making any progress. Same thing is here when we're talking about diversity, inclusion, belonging. It's not enough to tell people, all right, everybody, we've got to be more inclusive. Well, I am inclusive based on how I think I'm showing up. But unless we can give people concrete evidence that says, this is how you're showing up, this is where we need you to be, and these are the steps to help you close that gap, our chances of success are not very likely. So there's a tool that I like to use called the Ideal 360 survey. And basically, it helps leaders understand how inclusive they really are showing up versus how inclusive they think they're showing up based on the feedback they're getting from people who actually work with them. Does that sound like a tool that your group would be open to exploring?
I definitely think so. And I would say, Dr. Nita, that my executive team, there's 9 of us that are on that team. And then there's the next level of management. And those are the folks that are really touching outwardly to our organization. They're touching all the lives of the people that are in our organization. And my feeling is that those are the people that I would really want to go through this process so that they can begin thinking and breathing this and being able to transition that to the folks that they're working with.
And that strategy right there, again, it goes to business results and succession planning for the next level of leadership who are going to be in those positions to make those decisions specific to diversity, inclusion, and belonging, and making sure that that message is cascaded throughout the corporation. So I think that's great insight there. All right, let's look at your final question, I believe, Barb. So this may be a little uncomfortable. However, I always encourage people to become comfortable with discomfort because it's in the discomfort that we grow. So my question for you, Barb, is how diverse is your current executive leadership team and why is that?
And, I will say that when I hear that question, the first thought is, I feel that that's a judgmental question. And
Mhm.
instantly want to defend us and say, we're a good team, doggone it. We've been together a long time. But when I sit with the question, there's 9 of us, and I've been on the team for over 15 years now. And there's 3 of us that I would say have been on the team for over 15 years. There are 2 ladies, one obviously African American, and the rest are white male. And there has been times where we've had a female CFO that was in place, and then we transitioned with that person and a male came on board. Or in our CIO role, we've had 2 ladies in that position at some point in time, and now we have a male in that role. So when I think about diversity on our team, I am the only African American that's ever been on our executive team.
How do you feel about that, Barb?
I think that you don't recognize it sometimes until you're really asked that question or until something is going on within the workplace. I do think that within our team, there is a really good camaraderie. Strong friendships have been built on the team, and we really do work well with each other. I 100% know that I belong with my executive team. I know that I belong.
And I'm glad to hear you say that. And the word that you use, judgmental, I can absolutely understand that. Let's explore that for a little bit. So what I would say is let's reframe that from a feeling of judgmental to an opportunity to raise awareness. For instance, when you're thinking about an opening on your executive team, are you going back to the same talent pool that you've always gone back to? And even if you're going to the same talent pool and you've specifically said, we want a diverse candidate, do they understand that diversity does not necessarily mean from brown eyes to blue eyes? Do they understand that diversity means diversity of thought, diversity of approach, diversity of problem solving? What does that look like when you're looking to recruit executives at that level?
There's not a ton of turnover on the executive team, but at the times where we have had turnover, we have gone with pretty much the same executive search firm for a very long time. We're comfortable with them. They get us. They understand our culture. And what I think now in learning more about this and being able to dive in a little bit deeper is we've got to push ourselves a little bit. We've got to challenge ourselves. And I think that doing profiles for the position in advance and really penciling out, here are the things that we have already within our team, and here are some of the domains that we're not very strong in. Let's go and try to pull those other domains into the team so that we are just broader, we're more open that way.
Mm-hmm. And that again speaks to the strategy of being really specific and intentional about promotions throughout the company, especially middle management, who may ascend to those higher levels of
Yes.
leadership once those positions among your ranks are open.
Yes, you're spot on. And I think it's the brightest thing to do is to be able to help our teams know that there's room. There's room for people that are different. There's room for people that have different thoughts and different ideas. It's sometimes a matter of time before they move into those roles, but I think that's it's a key point for us to really look at that group and make sure that we're developing them as best as we can.
You know, just recently I had the wonderful privilege of listening to a fireside chat with Mr. Paul Martin, who's an SVP and the Chief Diversity Officer at Sony. Not sure if you were able to attend that, but it
Yes,
was
I
wonderful.
was.
Were you there? Excellent. It was a wonderful fireside chat. And he mentioned the fact that we need to see diversity, inclusion, and belonging as a lens through which we look at the company and still always make sure that we're looking at it from a business perspective. And in those terms, I like to think of it as a spectrum. There's this end of the spectrum that says I value every voice. And there's, let's be honest, keeping it real, this end of the spectrum that says I'm all about number one, right?
Yes.
Even if you're all about number one, it behooves us to make sure that everyone in the company feels safe and secure and comfortable and a sense of belonging to show up and do their very best work. So that whether you're on this end of the spectrum that says, I value every voice, or whether you're on this end of the spectrum that says, I'm out for number one, by valuing every voice, you're increasing the money that you can make for the company. You're increasing your opportunities for bonus. And so when we raise your awareness about how it behooves you from a business standpoint, and when I say you, I don't mean SC Fuels, I'm talking in general, how it behooves people from a business standpoint to just get on the bandwagon, that's raising awareness. And eventually we'll reach agreement as to why this is important, how it's important. For instance, being reflective of the community around you, right? Very often when companies go out and they decide to expand globally, Barb, what's one of the first things they do? Cultural awareness training.
Yes.
So if it's important enough to increase our revenue globally, we need to really see it as important enough to retain the type of workforce, right, that is going to then interact with that global community and raise the revenues for everyone, stakeholders,
Yes.
for everyone. And
Yes.
so it's just a win-win situation.
Yes.
So let's go to our
It's about
last chart.
balancing the shareholder, the employee, and the customers. Right?
Absolutely. And so when we look at the fact that belongingness is in the center of all of these things, for you, I would suggest that we look at alignment of strengths as you have done, continue to think about the ideal 360 and coaching for success, and data-driven behavior change, the change that says, this is where you are, this is where we need you to be, and this is how we'll help you close the gap. And then I like to start with experiential learning mastermind, specifically for the leadership team. I understand that every culture is just as different as every family, and we can't start at the same place for either one. And I recognize the value and importance of grassroots initiatives that start from the employees. However, you and I both know that if something is resonating with the executive team, it's going to get traction a little bit faster simply because of that level of support. And so when I work with executives, we spend time getting to know each other on a very personal and very profound level so that you can really show up and share your experiences as a Black woman, so that we can have white males show up and share their experiences, so that anyone who's on the leadership team can share their experiences from a different level and see people from a different light. It just doesn't work for leaders to say in the corporate world, all right, everybody, we're going to value diversity, inclusion, and belonging, right? But in their personal space, everybody looks like them.
Mhm.
So how can you show up with credibility to say, I'm going to lead this charge because I value the differences of everyone, but you don't have any personal differences in your space? So how would you know how to have these conversations with different people? So that's where I like to start. And from there, we get a lot of results that are qualitative, not necessarily quantitative. You can always look at the data again based from your Q12 survey. But when we're talking about qualitative data, we're talking about the fact that a leadership mastermind would be so successful that they then want to present that to their direct reports and share some of their own personal aha moments and learning to the point of tears and revelation and coming together, right? And then from there, it might encourage, let's start an ERG, or if we have few, let's see how we can make more. And ERGs don't have to be in how we present. It could be an ERG for people that think this way. It could be an ERG for people who like this activity. Whatever is going to bring us closer together as a culture to foster that sense of belonging, you can create an ERG for. A couple of other things, case studies, internal case studies that can be written just based on the experience of the leader, so that we can then again cascade that communication outward. And finally, based on what the leaders experience, based on the inputs that they're getting from their employees, based on the surveys that you got, that's a great opportunity to create a campaign that raises awareness. So when I work with clients, it's never about race relations, it's about real relationships. It's never about reaching agreement, it's about raising awareness. And it's never about shame and blame, it's about know and grow. So when we think about how all of those things give us belonging in the middle, it's crucial that we agree to be transparent, authentic, and that a sense of comfort is established so that people can show up that way. When people are comfortable enough to be authentic and transparent and vulnerable, then they develop a deeper sense of community. And once we develop a sense of community, we're more likely to commit for ourselves and for our co-learners on that journey, that very long journey that sometimes can take 7 to 10 years to experience real culture change. And I'm sure you're aware of that.
So,
So
Dr.
Barb, did you have, yes.
For a team that's our size, what's the period of time does it normally take for you to step in and kind of help consult our group with getting to a better place of inclusion?
I would say 3 to 6 months just to be able to plow the field and plant some seeds, so to speak. And a lot of times there are issues that are deeper that are surfaced through the initial work that we need to step back for a minute and re-vector and move forward. So the path is not always one shot. Sometimes it's 2 steps forwards and 3 steps back and 4 steps forwards, but always know that we will make progress.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for
Very
talking with me,
helpful.
Barb. I appreciate
Yes.
it.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists and our speakers today. What a fantastic time that we've shared and really helping us receive some action items, which I think, this group is really looking for, the enlightenment, but really how to consider and begin this journey. We are going to address some of the Q&A, and I'm thrilled that we're actually even running a little ahead of schedule, so you won't have to stay past 5:30 to do that. But a few things first, just to thank our council again, and some of those may have been familiar faces to you, but they invite you to reach out and have continued conversations. And as Andrew opened to say, that we have 3 more sessions designed around this DEI conversation that are going to be coming up for the rest of the year. So continue to stay tuned. The next is we want to invite you to stay connected. So please make sure that you're tagging us when you're posting, that you're including us in those conversations. We want to continue to stay really closely connected as an HR community between Orange County and Los Angeles. Let's just all broaden our sense of connection across Southern California. The next is to be looking ahead. And so if you haven't already, we encourage you to sign up for our next Mental Health in the Workplace on April 28th. Again, part 1 was around really helping you to understand where this important topic lands in your organization, the enlightenment, and the awareness, but now we're going to move into part 2 of how to activate new practices as a leader of people. So we really encourage you to join us for that conversation. And you can see the 3 subsequent dates that we will be sending out more information around our DEI. And lastly, pull out your pen if you haven't already. I need to, according to rules for SHRM and HRCI, I must verbally give you these numbers. So pay attention and get ready. The first is going to be the number for your SHRM credits. Today is 21 P as in Paul, U 93Q. Let me repeat that again. For SHRM, 21 PU93Q. For HRCI, it's 554170. Again, 554170. And lastly, you'll be delighted that as part of our follow-up email that we will be sending out, our wonderful partner at I4CP, which has been just a terrific partner, thought partner for NHRA, they have generously given us a DE&I playbook that we will be including a link to as part of our follow-up. And our hope is after each of these sessions that we will equip you with a section of a playbook to help you go back and start to take some actions that can start to drive a real change in your organization. So with that, with the few minutes we have, we're going to go ahead and review some of the Q&A that we have out there and get some great answers from our panelists for you.
Yes. So thank you, everybody. We have some great answers, some great questions that I think are worth diving into. And we're going to go through them somewhat in order. And I'm going to just tee this up to the panel. So from Barb to Jerry to Dr. Nina, feel free to share your thoughts. So we'll go as quickly as we possibly can. Let's see, the first one, where did it go? There was a question in here that I can't find anymore. Looks like it's gone. Okay. How do you recommend organizations best align DEI work with the mission and vision of the organization? We have many staff members who demand or expect organizations and leaders to be proactive or progressive, but many times their recommendations are outside of the scope or capabilities of the organization. How do we merge the mission and staff desires for action?
That's a really insightful question. I'll go ahead and take a stab at that first. First of all, it's important to remember that businesses are in the business to make money. And if businesses don't make money, no one's going to have a job. Diversity and inclusion is out the window. That being said, I think it's wise to make sure that your goals for diversity and inclusion are aligned with the business goals. So when I'm working with executives, we actually create a strategic inclusion plan that helps to support and maybe advance the regular business goals. We have to remember that businesses are in business for a reason, and that making sure we have an inclusive environment helps them reach those business goals even faster. So the more effective you can be at making sure that your strategic inclusion plan aligns with the business plan is really, I can't think of a better, more effective way to do it. And Paul even mentioned that as well. He said DE&I is a lens through which we look at business. And I think that that is wise advice from Paul.
Thanks, Dr. Nina. Any other thoughts, Jerry, Barb?
I think from a bigger standpoint, what that talks to me about is a little bit about your strategic planning process and how you set goals across the organization. When Dr. Nita and Paul talked a little bit about DEI being a lens, you know, when you're planning your strategic planning, if somebody should be in the room asking the question, great, so you've set your strategic plan, now put on those glasses that say DE&I and think about whether or not you're actually using that lens in the way that you're thinking about your next planning year. That's going to be one way that you have it at the strategic level. And then once you set performance management metrics into the actual workforce, that should trickle down into the actual people getting the work done.
Thanks, Jerry. Coming from a healthcare organization, we serve a very diverse population, do our best to hire diverse staff. We have done a good job of promoting people of color and female leaders heavily outnumber male leaders. how do we take DEI to the next level? And can you share strategies to recruit diverse new hires?
I can take that one. I love this question because this talks a little bit about a sophisticated organization that's actually been doing the work for a while. One place that I would look at is people often put so much energy into the inputs, who you're recruiting, and you don't look at the outputs, who's leaving the organization. And so you want to make sure that all this great talent that you're developing within the organization stays there, or they're moving into lateral positions of leadership within the organization. So look at your retention data, look at your churn data to make sure that that isn't a false positive of the work that you've been doing. I think the other place that you want to think about when you're thinking about your recruitment practices and how to get more diverse people is really think about your employment brand. How do you talk about yourself out in the world? How do you make sure that the way that you propose your job descriptions, your advertising, your career website is representative of the type of people you want to have come to work for your organization? Those are some really simple things that you can do almost immediately for very few dollars that are going to turn your recruitment practices around.
Hey, Jerry, Dr. Anita or Barb, any other additional thoughts?
I have nothing to add. Jerry was quite thorough. Thank you,
Yes,
Jerry.
he was very thorough. And I agree. It really is really trying to structure our position profiles so that we are bringing in that place where we have a gap, behaviors where we have a gap, and then let's try and look for people in those roles. I think the thing with being a Black female, if I were to go and look for a job tomorrow, I would want them to hire me because of the skills that I bring to the table, not because of the color of my skin. So much more to me than external. I want people to know me internally. So I would be careful when we talk about that is to understand that I don't think any of us ever want to be hired because of the color of our skin.
Barb, it's funny because, if you all that are listening today want to hear about the sausage making, Barb, and Anita, and myself had spent a lot of time thinking about the curriculum for this particular session. And one thing that we kept coming back to was excellence and diversity aren't in opposition of each other. You can have excellent people who also represent diverse populations at the same time. So you're not making those judgment calls in terms of what you're actually getting into the organization. That's a really great point, Barb.
I love this question because it's one that I hadn't thought of before, but how frequently should we engage or modify the metrics by which we measure the effectiveness of our D&I progress? How do we align metrics to motivating targeted behavior change?
I knew that this question was going to come up. Anita and Barb and I knew that this was going to come up in our prep session. Look, just like Paul said, we want to make sure that you are not orientating your organizations towards quantitative metrics that only tell you a single story about your organization. So if you see the needle moving significantly in your quantitative metrics, start to question the quality of the programming and the initiatives that you're putting out in the world, because what that's talking to you about is you may get the demographics right, you may get the churn right, but you actually may not be having the most inclusive environment, right? People on the ground still don't feel like they belong in the organization. So start to look at that.
That's right. And I would echo Jerry's sentiment by saying just because you have diversity, just because you have inclusion, just because you have equity does not necessarily mean that you have belonging. And it goes back to what are we seeing? What are we feeling? What are we hearing? And how are we showing up in terms of a workplace that really fosters a sense of belonging for everyone at every level, at every pay grade? That is one way to measure it. And again, we can go back to surveys like the Q12 or the Great Place to Work survey. Any type of survey that helps you get beneath the numbers, those are great ways to determine how well and how close you are to reaching your goals. And also remembering, again, just like every family is different, every culture is different. And there are cultures within cultures. You may have the culture of engineers. You may have the culture of office professionals. You may have the culture of middle managers. Often office professionals don't feel a sense of belonging because they feel undervalued and underappreciated. So there are many ways to slice that data that are not just numbers, but it goes to the quality of the experience that people have when they come to work.
There's a couple questions, and I want to move over to the chat. There was a few in there as well. Some of these are brief, but they might have be a bit of a rabbit hole. So we can address them, but just move on. One of the questions is could definitely be a rabbit hole. Can you please share with us 2 to 3 best practices to nurture inclusivity?
Oh, wow. That's a good one. I mean, look, I'll talk a little bit about what I'm doing in my current organization or what I proposed already, which is that the truth of the matter is lots of times in organizations, managers aren't taught to be good managers. There's strong individual contributors that are promoted as a result of their contributions to management positions. So what I'm starting to think about in my organization is how do we create solid management training, and we teach them the ways in which we actually want inclusive behaviors to show up in the workplace, so that it's not just at the executive level, but everybody has a common understanding of management practices and how to draw in their workforce. That's one thing that I'll share that I'm starting to do in my organization, and that I think actually worked in previous organizations that I've been with.
Thanks, Jerry. When somebody asks for 2 to 3 specifics, it's tough to come up with that right on the spot. Dr. Nina, Barb, any additional thoughts on that, or?
I
So
do
my
have some.
thought
Go
is
ahead, Barb.
on the Gallup survey that we do, there's 5 different questions that are asked that really do help us understand inclusion, and we can always take a deeper dive into those 5 questions to really get to the meat of it, so that we can determine what's really going on. So I do think that the surveys that are out there are very useful tools in helping us get to the answers that we have.
And one very simple practice is to think about how we act. This is an acronym that I just recently developed for a talk that I'm preparing to present. And ACT very simply says, approach others with an open heart, connect with others and listen to understand, not to respond, and then tap into diversity by being culturally curious. If we can just get in that habit of being mindful of how we act, approaching others with an open heart, connecting to understand, not to respond, and tapping into diversity by being curious, that will go leaps and bounds to help us think about our behavior.
Thanks, Dr. Nina. Go ahead, Jerry.
So smart. I just love you guys. Learning so much from this.
Andrew, I want to elevate the voice of one of our council members who's not on the panel today, but is actually texting all of us right now. Leila Nordquist is the Vice President of HR at Stamps.com, and she talks a little bit about the idea around disaggregating your data, right? Sometimes when you do your surveys, it gives you a global perspective on your whole workforce. But when you start to break that up, either through looking at your gender or your diversity differences or who they report to, you start to see those micro changes in how people are actually feeling at the place of work. And I would also say that, she talks about qualitatively when people show up, for instance, Asians and women often don't feel like they can speak up in a big meeting about their experiences. So disaggregation is really important because it actually gives voice to the folks that often don't feel like their voice is carried in an organization.
Thank you, Jerry. Lolita will be heavily prominent in our next session, so much more to come from her. I'm going to bounce back and forth a little bit between chat and some of these other questions, but I just want to address, Mindy asked a question, Mindy Isaac, that we can get back to you on, Mindy. We won't address it right now because it's very specific, but it just asks for any recommendations for customizable unconscious bias training for large organizations. Mindy, we can get some data over to you, and we'll send you an email on that. Next question, how do we deal with, let me just make sure I'm reading this the right way. How do we deal with all the different beliefs and philosophies that range from really true inclusion for all versus that range from really true inclusion for all versus white fragility and not having the right to contribute to the discussion?
That's a biggie. I'm going to jump in here on this one. I'm just going to answer that question by not answering the question, but answering the question. So in my work, really very, very recently, I'm very, very sensitive to the fact, and Paul mentioned this, that in our pursuit of inclusion, we inadvertently and unintentionally tend to exclude the voice specifically of white males. And we really got to be careful about that, because we can't get there without everyone. Everyone needs to be included. And I was so touched the other day talking with a colleague who is the president and CEO of a company who really looks at these types of things. And he said, you know, I'd be really thrilled if I could just sit down and ask some questions of you and just have you coach me. That is humility, because when we talk about white fragility, when we talk about white privilege, we could go several different places with that. And what I like to say is the question is not what you do about white privilege, because you can't do anything about being white. The question is, what do you do with the privilege that comes from being white? Meaning that, how can you use your privilege to open doors? How can you be more aware of your privilege and step into humility and exercise curiosity to get to know other people, other perspectives, other points of view, other backgrounds, other ways of knowing and being known? So those are some ideas that I've been really thinking deeply about them. And I just kind of wanted to offer that as a thought starter for someone.
That's great, Dr. Anita. Great response. Jerry?
What she said, and times 1,000. Listen to Dr. Anita. You will never go wrong.
Jerry.
So two final questions that are pretty brief. And I don't know if there's that much to really dive into them, but they're interesting. How does affirmative action tie into DEI?
Yeah, I'll answer that question because I always, like Paul, I also went to law school and I always think about these from compliance and legal terms. If you think about affirmative action, that is a floor and DEI is a ceiling, and that ceiling has not yet been reached, right? So if you are in a state that actually practices affirmative action, you are not meeting DEI standards. All you're doing is meeting some compliance standard that's set by some random state board there. When you're thinking about DEI, you are actually creating a culture that is actually transforming the way that you are working in your organization and transforming the society around it. Remember, and I'll go out on a limb and say this, right? This is a big limb for me to do this, say this in my personal life. I say all the time that this country was founded on slavery and the slavery of Black people, right? And so when you think about diversity, equity, inclusion work, it is about reversing the tide of what this country has been built on so that everybody has a fair chance to actually thrive in this nation. That's my big kind of political answer for that particular one.
That's good. Dr. Anita, Barb, any other thoughts? Okay.
And Jerry's so eloquent.
Last question, unless Shannon, you see something that I'm missing. And this is a philosophical question. What are your thoughts on how cancel culture impacts DEI? Meaning, if someone says something wrong, then they are immediately barred from opportunities and access.
Now will take a stab at that one. And I go back to the story that I shared, and that something was said, and it was pretty difficult to hear. And had I not stayed the course, then we would not be in the place that we're in today. And so I do think that forgiveness is a big piece of where we need to be. And it starts with us. It starts with us saying that I'm confident in who I am. I'm gonna push through the things that I need to push through. And I hope that someone learns something on the other end. And in me staying the course, I learned a ton and was able to be alongside this man that I think is just, when he was on this earth, he was just a giant. And he still lives in my heart. So if I had left, I never would have felt that. And I never would have repaired the relationship of the person that said something that was offensive to me. And then he never would stop and think. I believe today that if someone came into an interview, that he would look at them with a fairer lens than maybe he would have 15 years ago. I think it's good to forgive and best to move forward.
A fantastic response, Barb.
Mhm. I agree with Barb 100%. Cancel culture does not allow us to extend grace to ourselves for having a misstep. And it certainly does not encourage us to extend grace to others for having a misstep. We all have bias. We may not be aware of all of our biases, but we all have it, which means we're all prone to saying the wrong thing and just putting it out there. But if we're more careful to think about how we manage the intent of our words with the impact of our words, and again, to be willing to extend grace to ourselves when we mess it up, but more importantly, extend grace to others, how else are we going to get to know one another if we don't allow that error of that what's the word I'm looking for? Margin of error that we all have in us simply because we're human beings. So Barb, you said that beautifully. And I just wanted to emphasize what you said about the importance of forgiveness. Who in here has not said something that immediately it came out of our mouths? We're like, oh, that was not the right thing to say. It didn't come out right. Who has not done that? And so we just need some forgiveness and grace.
Thank you, Dr. Anita. Shannon, am I missing any other questions or did I catch?
No, just a comment, Dr. Nita, if we'll include your ACT statement and the recap email for everyone, that would be great.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and I think that brings us to a close. So we do have our upcoming events, the next mental health event, which we would love for you to join. As we shared, this is just the first session of our 4-part program series on DE&I. I can just tell you, being a white man myself, when we first embarked on this, trying to get a sense as to what my role was within the council, it's been such a blessing to be a part of it. And I've learned so much from it. And I think all of us are at that point. Many of us are at that point where we just don't know where to start and how to start. So our hope is to give back to the community knowledge and actionable items that you can take back to your workforce. And this is the first session. Our second session will take you to that next step. Our third session to the next step, and our fourth session, it never really is closed, but get you to a point where you have as close to a fully developed DEI program within your organization. So on behalf of the entire council, but on behalf of Orange County NHRA and LA NHRA, we want to thank you for attending today, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Thank you, council members.
Bye.